Hello, I'm Marc McKee, Managing Editor for the Missouri Review. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of 3 videos celebrating the winners of the 29th Annual Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize. Ordinarily, we fly the winners into Columbia, Missouri for a reading and reception. There are meatballs, unwieldy cheeses, vegetarian options, wine, a photo booth, and usually someone with a stringed instrument playing us in as we enjoy readings and conversation with our winners. Alas, in 2020, this is not the move, or even an act of irremediable peril. At any rate, we hope that you'll enjoy this adaptation we've thrown ourselves into, which at least has the happy capacity to be shared widely with no cost to you but your time. I'm here to tell you, friends and neighbors, that the story you're about to hear and the author you're about to meet will repay that time several-fold. Joining us this virtual eve will be Seth Fried, the 2019 winner in fiction for Trezzo, who will be introduced by our contest editor, Bailey Boyd.
I'm so extremely excited to be celebrating Seth Fried and his Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize winning story, Trezzo, tonight. I love this story, that of an unlikely high school friendship forged through mad scientist type experiments and the desire to provide for a family, even more every time I read it. And when I was thinking about this introduction, I considered shining lights on all of the literary qualities that I admire about it, the incredible dialogue, the perfect amount of backstory and pacing, a gripping plot, and the surprise of that plot's slow grip, the narrative arc, and I could go on. But then I realized that each time I read it, I'm so enthralled by this world of Ronnie and Jacobs that I nearly forget about all of that. Because like all crafts done well, its construction feels light and effortless, its joints and seams hidden from view. So instead, I'd like to tell you about the first time I read this story. Many months ago now, it was in the soft, incessant glow of my laptop that I met Ronnie Trezzo and was introduced to the questions he asked about the world, the ones that not everyone considers, but that not a whole lot of people can answer either. Ronnie's questions made me laugh out loud in that soft blue lit glow, and he kept me chuckling as I got to know him better. But eventually I was sitting behind my laptop not chuckling, but instead in deep contemplation of all that Trezzo asked me to consider. Friendships, the maturity that goes unnoticed in so many young people, the stories we may never know that require such maturity and wisdom in those young people, the power of asking really, really good questions, and the harm inflicted by those in power who don't ask them enough. I loved what Ronnie and Jacob in this story made me ponder, and when I return to this story, I'm continually grateful that they still make me laugh, while they also challenge me to think. I'm deeply appreciative for both of those gifts. So, without any more ado from me, I am so thrilled to turn it over to Seth Fried, winner of the 2019 Editor's Prize in Fiction. Seth Fried is a fiction and humor writer. He is the author of the novel The Municipalists and the short story collection The Great Frustration. His short stories have appeared in Tin House, One Story, McSweeney's, The Kenyon Review, Vice, and others.
Thank you so much, Bailey. That introduction was amazing. And thank you, Marc, for putting this together. And just thank you so much to the Missouri Review and to Jeffrey Smith, the benefactor of the prize. It's such an honor to work with you all once more and for this contest. It's just great to see you all. And thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from the story. This is the story's opening. Mr. Hyde wrote digestive system on the board, and Ronnie Trezzo's hand shot up. Hyde turned to face the class, then froze when he saw Ronnie already had a question. The classroom was quiet except for the burble from the aquariums along the far wall and Ronnie's impatient grunts as he pumped his hand in the air. Hyde leaned back into the chalkboard as if to brace himself. I'd been in classes with Ronnie before and had never known him to be a curious student. But that year in Hyde's life science class, he'd started sitting in the front row and asking questions. If evolution was real, why did people have to invent shoes? How much food would you have to give an elephant to kill it? What would happen if you shot an atom bomb with a bow and arrow? At 13, Ronnie was already 5'10" and thin but tough looking, with a head of dark, matted curls. Hyde was half a foot shorter than Ronnie and tended to answer his questions as if humoring a superior. Ronnie's hand stayed raised and Hyde let his shoulders slap as he almost whispered, "Yes?" Ronnie cleared his throat and said he actually had 2 questions. First, he wanted to know how our bodies told the difference between pee and poop. Second, he was curious if the 2 ever got mixed up, pee coming out of a butt or poop coming out of a pee hole. Now I'll just pause real quick and just mention that there is strong language in the story. Just to catch everybody up, moving on. The students who usually laughed at Ronnie's questions looked at one another with their mouths hanging open, trying to read from each other's faces if they'd heard him right. Hyde's bald head turned a velvety shade of red while Ronnie waited for an answer, a chewed-up Bic poised over the open notebook on his desk. "That is enough," Hyde said, his voice husky with rage. "That is enough out of you." "If you don't know," Ronnie said, "just say so." "Quiet," Hyde shouted. "I don't want to hear another word." He slammed the stick of chalk he was holding into the board's metal tray. The stick broke and the top half fell to the floor, rolling under his desk. The class was caught off guard by Hyde's overdue outburst. Everyone was silent as he banished Ronnie from the front row and told him to keep his mouth shut for the rest of the year. His new seat was next to mine, and when he dropped himself into it, the legs gave a quick screech against the tile. Ronnie cracked his knuckles and seemed to think the situation over before turning to me and whispering, "It's because I stumped him." I had a healthy fear of Ronnie, so I nodded. He could have told me he was the 18th president of the United States, and I would have nodded all the same. In the 5th grade, Ronnie had picked up our lunch chaperone, Mr. Vestruvio, and placed him upside down in a garbage can. He narrowly escaped expulsion on account of his seemingly earnest belief, both during and after the incident, that he and Mr. Vestruvio had been, quote, "just clowning." Before that, when Ronnie was 9 years old, he'd allegedly killed his next-door neighbor's horse, and the story had followed him ever since. Once, while he was trading insults with Roger Mahalik in gym class during a game of broomball, Mahalik had shouted that Ronnie was a sicko who'd used his alky dad's rusted-out truck to knock the head off a horse. In response, Ronnie just stood there, using the handle of his broom to scratch his chin while we all stopped to look at him. "So," he said after a while, "what have you ever done?" There were plenty of reasons for me not to be excited to find myself sitting next to Ronnie Trezzo, but on that day I was thinking mostly about Annie Miller, whom I'd practically been sitting next to before Ronnie got moved to the empty seat between us. Annie was a serious girl with brown hair who wore floor-length denim skirts and mature-looking blouses with lace collars and ruffled sleeves. She approached life science with an air of professional determination, taking relentless notes and prolonging the end of class by asking Hyde lawyerly questions about the homework. When called on, she answered in a tone that suggested a deep and long-standing knowledge of the subject matter, as if oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange was something she and her friends liked to discuss in their free time. I was an average student and came from what I'd heard adults refer to as a broken home. My mom was a single parent who worked hard but could get so far behind on bills that sometimes there was no electricity when I got home. For me, Annie wasn't just a crush. She was a glimpse into a world of dizzying stability, a place where there were beautiful girls with green eyes and all the right answers. We never spoke. I knew without having to try that I couldn't flirt with her like your pretty boy Eddie Beckelman's or your jockish Lucas Mernson's. That's why Ronnie's idiotic questions had been a godsend. When he asked if alligators were bulletproof, or why no one had invented a shower you could flush, the students around us typically joined in the resulting laughter. But to impress Annie, I always shook my head as if I disapproved. The first time I did it, she nodded in agreement and mouthed, "Oh my God." Over time, we settled into looks of studious camaraderie that were the highlight of my day. But those fleeting interactions were gone forever now that Ronnie occupied the space between us, his body odor making the air smell suddenly like lunch meat and cut grass. I leaned forward to exchange a glance with Annie, hoping she might want to share a furtive laugh at our misfortune. Instead, she stared straight ahead in steely annoyance. It seemed obvious she'd never look in my direction again. Ronnie noticed my pained expression as I watched Annie and mistook it for a reaction to Hyde's treatment of him. Right? He said. All I did was ask a fucking question. Hyde looked sharply back at us, his forehead covered in the nervous sweat of the naturally conflict avoidant. A tense moment passed before he continued his lecture. I could tell when Ronnie started to fidget in his seat that more questions had occurred to him. When he finally went still, lulled into a state of grisly fascination by a detailed description of stomach acid, I noticed him staring down at the closed spiral-bound notebook on his desk. Its pages were curling up at the corners, and it had a distressed blue cover on which Ronnie had scratched the word experiments. In the hallway after class, I was surprised to hear his voice over my shoulder. Hey, life science, he said, as if it were my name. He had followed me to my locker, and the sight of him approaching made me freeze in the act of retrieving my history book. It was only a few minutes till the next bell, but he was strolling casually with his notebook tucked under one arm, along with a copy of our school newspaper, the Bronco Bulletin. Did you hear that stuff today? He said, leaning against the locker next to mine. In class? No, he said, in my spread open butt. I stared at him, my hand still on my history book. Of course in class. About digestion? Exactly, he said, leaning toward me. Stomachs, man. I told him I had to get to class and held up my textbook as proof. Wait, he said. You seem like a smart kid, and I could use some help. I'm not smart. Ronnie appraised me for a moment, then reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. Hear me out. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. We're going to have some questions now. First of all, our first question, rather, will be from senior editor Evelyn Somers.
Hey.
So I'm interested always in what makes stories go, where their energy comes from. And in this story, it seems to me that a lot of the charm and the momentum comes from a classic comic pairing of a straight or more restrained character, your narrator, Jacob, and then one who's uncontrolled and anarchic, Trezzo, who's hilariously out of control. But like all good writing with the comic impulse, there are sad and dark elements in this story as well. Trezzo's dad is an alcoholic. Trezzo's an outsider, almost an outcast at school. And Jacob's family is poor, which puts him on the outside too. Then there's the ending that gives us a moment of serious and triumphant moral choice that we know is not going to be the end of things. So my question is, how did you think about the balance of comedic to serious when you were writing the story? Did you ever find yourself leaning too far in one direction or wrestling to make it more comic or more serious? Or did that seem to fall into place naturally?
Thank you for your question. But yeah, I think the impulse for the story started with me where it's like I always tell my students to kind of look for something that you have an intense reaction to, like something that feels very urgent to you. For obvious reasons, like bullies have always been sort of interesting to me, like because I've always kind of been on one end of that dynamic. I was really interested in that, and I thought that there was something interesting in it, and so I just started approaching the story to kind of make fun of the bully dynamic, and the early free writing was really just making fun of Trezzo a lot, and just kind of the morbidly comic thing of kind of I have that Kafka impulse of just sort of like, well, I hate this, let's just see someone deal with that, and that's kind of how I scratch my itch as a story writer. But a fun thing happens with story, and especially the kind of the buddy comedy as a narrative form, is that that gets boring. When you write about your point of view character being right and the other person being terrible, there's sort of a thermal dynamics there that takes over, where you kind of reach a point where you realize like, oh, but Trezzo has some things about his personality that are more effective than my narrator. And my narrator is just trying to escape pain, but he's not acting with integrity. And so a thing I've heard about kind of some stories is that like what's considered important at the beginning and what's considered unimportant at the beginning by the end should switch. And I think with this kind of dynamic, that's true too. Like the person who is just sort of morally unsalvageable at the beginning and at the end, it's switched, or not unsalvageable, but in question. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, I think I started out with a lot of jokes, with thinking Trezzo was very funny, thinking this everything about him was just a joke, and then kind of finding his humanity. But just because you need texture, like as you're drafting, you start to be like, well, this is starting to fall flat because he's all one way. So I started to to keep myself interested, I had to make him more of a person. And then that's kind of what I've heard, like John Gardner kind of talk about, like the morality of fiction. I think that's kind of where it comes. It's like, it's almost a function of the craft. You end up getting a more empathetic moral high ground, just because otherwise the story wouldn't work. Does that make sense?
Hi, again, Seth, thank you so much for that. I was so glad to be able to hear that introduction to the story and your voice. So thank you. My question is about something that you bring up in your author note in the magazine, which is how for a long time you kind of rejected the idea of writing about places that, quote, looked like where you grew up. And so I'm wondering what changed your thinking and led you to begin writing about those very places, and if you did end up discovering any lessons as you incorporated those places and experiences into your writing.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think that I am interested in usually my mode has been kind of more abstract, sort of like writing in like a higher register, like sort of like fables or absurdism, things like that. I think that I do like that, and I wish that in the States, I wish we had a stronger tradition of sort of not strictly representative narrative art. I think it's something we struggle with. So whenever something high concept or weird kind of succeeds here, I'm like, yay. But I think the part of me though that was shunning realism or traditional kind of storycraft was more about, I think for traditional storycraft, I didn't know how it worked. So I did the thing that all kind of younger people do, which is sort of like, I don't understand how it works, so I'm going to tell you 10 reasons why it's stupid. And so I just kind of did that thing for a while until I just realized, like, oh no, it's just like, if people can do it, you can do it. Try it, to see what it feels like. And I found out I loved it, and just in a different way than those other stories. I think also there was another moving part though, that like, I don't want to shock anybody, but there are some writers who write because they have low self-esteem, and they are trying to kind of create a product that in their minds will earn them their spot on the planet. I'm not saying this is everybody, but I think this was definitely me. And I think so while I knew that stories had to contain kind of some sort of important truth or something that was urgent to me, I really tried to cover over the facts of my actual life because I wasn't proud of that. And I thought that I had to, and this is a lot of artists do this. It's like I love Tom Waits and David Bowie, and they seem to have spent as much energy on their work as convincing you that they're from another planet, which is like good on them. Like it worked, and I love them. But I think it was just as I got older, the good thing about getting older, one of the good things is just sort of like, when you're a kid, your mom will send you into a store to buy something with a bag of change, and you'll be mortified and be like, I'm not going in, I'm not doing it. But then as you get older, it's like, now I'm the person in CVS being like, oh, excuse me, teenage clerk, I need the extra strength foot medicine. Like, just all of my shame has kind of fallen away. And I just want to look at the mistakes that are like mistakes I've actually made, and the background that actually built who I am as a person. And I think in all respects as a writer, don't cut yourself off from your observations or your experience for thinking that they're not good enough or interesting enough, because that's a source of strength. And I think, in fact, a lot of my worst writing has come from trying to hide who I am to too far a degree. Yeah, sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for talking about that a little bit. That was so interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and this is Speer Morgan, and I'll add to that, when I'm helping to judge the contest, I pay no attention to who the author is. And I read this story originally with no knowledge of who the author was. And I thought, wow, this is a fantastically good story in the tradition of realism that really has heart. And in some ways, it's very much almost in the high realist mode. And when I discovered that Seth Fried had written it, I couldn't believe it because, of course, I had read The Siege when you wrote when you were, I don't know, 24 years old, or Loika Discovered, which we also published. And so it made me think about this tradition of the kind of conceptual story again. And so I'm not really asking about this story. I'm asking about your interest in that form. And, you know, you could say that there are authors who are in the tradition of high realism who themselves began to shade off into almost conceptual artifice, like Henry James, of course, and there's some who very definitely shaded off, you know, like, you know, Kafka's too obvious because he's an expressionist, but even somebody like Chekhov, you know, playing with the flexibility of form, or in the 1970s, all the American writers playing with metafiction or artifice or self-conscious artifice or whatever. So can you talk a little bit more about your interest in that form, just quite aside from this story? I mean, just talk about it. I mean, when I first read The Siege, and in some ways it's a simple story, but it's really a kind of profound story because it ultimately is about historiography. It's like, how do you judge the times? How do you understand the times and the passage of time? So enough said. You just comment on that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's yeah. I think of Hemingway too, sort of like with his last book, kind of retreating sort of into fable a little bit. And it's an interesting distinction, and like one I throw out in class a lot. Is fiction versus story, where I think I say to my students, like, you know, you might not be interested in conflict, you know, that's sort of like the traditional storycraft. You might just want to write a fake letter or a description of a fake historical event. And so it's like, don't let me discourage you from that, but that's distinct from story, which is like has things that work in itself. And I think for me, the appeal, and I still like kind of high concept idea driven fictions, you know, sort of like fake essays, things like that. The thing I like about it is also the thing that's dangerous about it and hard about it, which is total freedom, which is sort of like, again, like as I get more experience as a writer, like I always tell my students, like, my worst nightmare as a writer is someone says, we're going to pay you $250,000 to write a 400-word essay. And I'm like, great, what is it? And they're just like, it can be about whatever you want. It's just like, oh, that's never mind. You know, it's not having any constraints is a problem. You know, it's one of the hardest things to face. So it's like, when I was kind of avoiding more traditional craft to write fictions, I didn't understand how hard what I was doing was. You kind of had to build up a whole new concept of what was going on every time you sat down to write them. So it's like kind of one of those things where, and I'm not trying to blow smoke in my direction, but like, you know, it was, having done this, it's like storycraft definitely is challenging, but it's great some days, and like some days it's like building a shelf. There's things that just work in story that you can kind of relax your sense of ego about it. Whereas every time I sat down to write a fiction, I kind of had to be like, well, I'm brilliant. What's one of my brilliant ideas? And like that can go sour real fast and can go boring really fast. So yeah, so I think that for me has been the revelation. And I think it also, I learn more writing stories because it's sort of like the external demands of the form kind of pull me to a higher ground, and it's kind of it gets me to a place where it's I feel in a better position to forgive myself, to forgive others. It's a really genuinely moving experience to write a story, and you're like, by the end of it, you're kind of chasing after the car, you know. So that's been my experience with it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a distinction I'm fascinated with, because then I will still kind of like, with fictions, it's more kind of like, I can just wait for my muse to come find me, you know. I don't have to completely shut that out, but I don't have to have that be my only creative outlet. So for me, that's been really it's been amazing. And I think it's just the advice I try to give to writers is just like, don't shut yourself off from something. Like, people write all kinds of stories, and you're a person, so you get to write whatever kind of story is out there. So I excited, and that's, you know, mainly talking to myself there, because I spent so many years defensive and uncertain about that type of story.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Seth.
Hi, Seth. Thanks again for the reading and for your responses to all these questions, which have been illuminating themselves. I just have, my question is based out of my, I mean, I read the story, I skimmed the story before I had the opportunity in the temporary new normal to record the audio version of this story for our digital subscribers. And when I was reading it for the recording, the exhilaration that I felt towards the end of the story was kind of overwhelming. I mean, I really worked to keep my voice at a distinctly narrative and narrator kind of like level, even as I wanted to just be jumping up and down and being kind of in triumph at the choice that this narrator was making. I don't want to give away the ending, but the narrator makes this choice that feels heroic, where readers are often conditioned, I feel like, to expect failure or a loss of nerve or character, especially in stories that are recalling like a youth that wasn't always, that wasn't particular, that the older narrator doesn't really particularly feel proud of necessarily, but here he gets to. And I was wondering, at what point for you does the choice the narrator makes become the right choice for you to make as the writer of the story?
Great, thank you for that reading. Also, I loved it when I got the digital issue, and I was listening on my earbuds and being like, what is the narcissism rating on this for listening to the audio version of my own short story? But it was too good. Those dulcet tones pulled me in. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think something I always kind of, when I'm teaching plot, it's I tend to use the word, I favor the word reversals over twist, because I think the key is looking backwards at what you've already written versus looking forwards. And I think a lot of times some thinner, kind of tinnier endings come from the writer pulling themselves forward, feeling like they need to pull a magic trick out of a hat, instead of just looking at the world of the story and being like, where's the momentum here? Like, where is this leading? So I knew without wanting to spoil anything, I did want to have it be kind of uplifting in a sort of affirmational, aspirational sense of the character's choice. And the way I knowing that I was kind of risking sentimentality there, I think where I found the texture, I hope, is that I think that decision still doomed him in a practical sense in the short term. So that for me is I just looked for texture in that moment. But no, and I agree, because I love contemporary short stories, but I do think a lot of them can end up being sort of snuff filmish, where it's like we just kind of go to a low point and we're sort of like and I would always be hungry again, and then then you're out. But yeah, I wanted to earn it, but I think it's story is kind of a ritual and a rehearsal for life. So I wanted to it's important for me sometimes to be like, there are good choices you can make that are meaningful, and so that felt good to me, and that felt right, and I'm glad it sounded like it landed. But yeah, I was worried of it being maybe too soupy, but I was hoping that the rumors of him wearing a diaper would temper that a little bit. So hopefully. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Well, it certainly, yeah, it certainly landed for me. I felt that reversal was excellent. Where I experienced a bit of like feeling some trepidation, and then yeah, just a kind of, I was really rewarded. This is the part of the night where if anyone else has a question that has been spontaneously kind of like has blossomed for them and they'd like to ask Seth, that'd be great. At any rate, does anyone have another question?
Well, the story really resonated for me, Seth, because I have a brother with ADD who's quite the comedian, and I have a son who asks not quite such outrageous questions in his science classes, and definitely is quite bright, but was always the one who came up with those questions. And as I was reading the experiments, I was thinking about how many times as a parent I had to squash something that was coming pretty close to some of those experiments that Trezzo and Jacob were doing. So it was high entertainment for me, and also a little bit of a sense of deja vu as I was reading it.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I have a nephew who I watched a lot while I was growing up, and I remember just once seeing him at the top of the stairs in one of those longer laundry baskets, and I was like, absolutely not. And he was just like, no, I'm gonna slide down. Like I didn't understand what the project was, and I was just like, no, absolutely not. So it's just I also have come to like a later appreciation of like Kelvin and Hobbes, and just that kind of like that nostalgic ideal of rambunctious younger kids is I had a lot of observations coming into that, so I'm glad that those worked.
Yes, as the father of a 5-year-old who insists that he's inventing things that actually have come into being now that he's alive. There's some identification with Ronnie Trezzo though. All right, great. I think that I'm going to throw to Kris, and she can sing us out.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, I'm Kris Somerville, TMR's marketing coordinator. And I'd like to end the evening with thanking Seth Fried. We've been a big fan of his work for a number of years, and we've had the good fortune of publishing him 3 times. And you can look for Trezzo in TMR Books anthology, Strange Encounters, which this story indeed is. Thank you to Mark, Bailey, and Jacob. Thank you for planning this event, I should say. Thank you for Jeff Smith, who continues to endow the Editor's Prize, which we appreciate. And of all people, I thought it would be nice to thank Speer Morgan. He still reads every day about 30 stories from the slush pile and yells, literally with great enthusiasm, when he finds a wonderful story. And he did that with Trezzo last Christmas in New York City, which is a time when we traditionally read the Editor's Prize, fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. So that short story, I have to say, was a great Christmas gift. So thank you, and thank you for this evening.